Sarah Martinez had always dreamed of serving her country. Growing up in a small town in Texas, she watched her grandfather's old war medals gleam in the sunlight every morning as he polished them with care. He would tell her stories of bravery, sacrifice, and the bond between soldiers that could never be broken. Those stories planted a seed in her heart that grew stronger with each passing year. When Sarah turned 18, she walked into the Marine Corps recruitment office with determination burning in her eyes. The recruiter, Sergeant Williams, looked at the petite young woman standing before him and wondered if she truly understood what she was signing up for. Sarah stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, but her voice was steady and strong when she said she wanted to serve as a combat medic. The training at Paris Island was brutal. Sarah faced challenges that pushed her body and mind to their absolute limits. While other recruits struggled with the physical demands, Sarah found her strength in helping others. During long marches, she would encourage the soldiers who were falling behind. When someone got injured during training exercises, she was always the first to rush to their aid. Her instructors noticed something special about her. She had a natural ability to remain calm under pressure and make quick decisions that could save lives. After months of rigorous training, Sarah graduated as one of the top recruits in her class. Her grandfather sat in the audience, tears streaming down his weathered face as he watched his granddaughter receive her Eagle, Globe, and Anchor. She had become a United States Marine, and more importantly, she had earned the right to serve as a combat medic, a role that would put her directly in harm's way to save the lives of her fellow Marines. Sarah's first deployment took her to a remote base in Afghanistan. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, with mountains that seemed to touch the sky and valleys that held secrets and dangers. The base housed over 500 Marines, and Sarah quickly became known as the medic who would go anywhere and do anything to help her fellow soldiers. She treated everything from minor cuts and bruises to serious injuries sustained during combat operations. The other Marines respected her not just for her medical skills, but for her unwavering courage. She never hesitated to run into dangerous situations if someone needed help. During her first month at the base, a roadside bomb exploded near a patrol convoy. While others took cover, Sarah sprinted toward the blast site, her medical bag bouncing against her hip as she ran through the smoke and debris to reach the wounded Marines. Captain Rodriguez, the base commander, watched Sarah work that day and knew he had someone special under his command. She moved with purpose and precision, her hands steady as she applied tourniquets and administered life-saving treatments. 2 Marines owed their lives to her quick actions that day, and word of her bravery spread throughout the base like wildfire. As weeks turned into months, Sarah became the heart of the medical unit. She worked long hours, often staying up all night to monitor critically wounded soldiers. Her small quarters were always open to anyone who needed to talk, and many Marines found comfort in her presence during the darkest moments of their deployment. She had a gift for making people feel safe and cared for, even in the middle of a war zone. The other medics looked up to Sarah as their leader, even though she wasn't the highest-ranking member of the team. She had earned their respect through her actions, her dedication, and her willingness to put herself at risk for others. Every morning she would check on each member of her team, making sure they had everything they needed to do their jobs effectively. Sarah's reputation for courage and compassion reached far beyond her own base. Other units began requesting her assistance for particularly dangerous missions. She never refused, knowing that her skills could mean the difference between life and death for wounded soldiers. Her commanding officers trusted her completely, knowing that she would do whatever it took to bring their Marines home safely. The call came in at dawn on a Tuesday morning that would change everything. Intelligence reports indicated that a small village 20 miles from the base was under attack by enemy forces. Worse yet, a school filled with children and several wounded civilians were trapped inside the conflict zone. The mission was clear but dangerous. Get in, evacuate the wounded, and get out before enemy reinforcements arrived. Captain Rodriguez assembled his best team for the operation. Without hesitation, he included Sarah as the lead medic. She gathered her equipment, checked her supplies twice, and prepared for what everyone knew would be one of the most challenging missions of their deployment. The helicopter ride to the village was tense, with Sarah reviewing emergency medical procedures in her mind, while the landscape rushed past below them. When they landed, the sound of gunfire echoed through the narrow streets. Sarah's team immediately split up to cover more ground and locate the wounded civilians. The school building had taken heavy damage, with part of the roof collapsed and debris scattered everywhere. Sarah could hear children crying inside, and her heart raced as she realized the gravity of the situation they were facing. Moving carefully through the rubble, Sarah and her team found 6 wounded civilians, including 3 children who had been hurt when part of the building collapsed. The injuries were severe: broken bones, deep cuts, and one elderly man who appeared to have internal bleeding. Sarah knew she had to work fast, but she also had to be thorough. One mistake could cost someone their life. As Sarah began treating the most critically wounded, the sound of gunfire grew closer. Enemy forces were advancing toward their position, and the team had limited time before they would need to evacuate. Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she stabilized the elderly man's condition and carefully splinted a young girl's broken arm. Every second counted, but she refused to rush through procedures that could determine whether these people lived or died. The team leader's voice crackled through Sarah's radio, informing her that they had 5 minutes before they needed to move to the extraction point. Sarah looked at the wounded civilians around her and knew that 5 minutes wasn't enough time to properly treat everyone. She made a decision that would define her career and her character. She told her team to take the most critically wounded to the helicopter while she stayed behind to treat the others. Corporal Johnson, one of Sarah's closest friends, argued with her decision. He knew how dangerous it was to stay behind, especially with enemy forces closing in on their position. But Sarah was determined. She couldn't leave knowing that people would die without immediate medical attention. She promised Johnson that she would follow with the remaining civilians as soon as she could get them stabilized for transport. As her team disappeared around the corner carrying the first group of wounded, Sarah found herself alone with 3 injured civilians. The gunfire was getting louder, and she could hear vehicles approaching in the distance. Her hands shook slightly as she worked, but her training took over. She applied pressure bandages, administered pain medication, and prepared the remaining wounded for what would be a dangerous journey to the extraction point. Sarah's radio crackled with urgent messages from her team leader. The helicopter could only wait a few more minutes before it would have to leave without them. Enemy forces were now visible on the outskirts of the village, and staying any longer would put the entire rescue operation at risk. Sarah knew she was running out of time, but she also knew she couldn't live with herself if she abandoned the people who were counting on her. With the last civilian stabilized, Sarah helped the 3 wounded individuals to their feet and began the treacherous journey through the damaged village toward the extraction point. Every step was carefully planned, as they had to avoid both the unstable debris and the advancing enemy forces. Sarah's medical bag felt heavier with each step, but she never once considered leaving it behind. The sound of the helicopter's rotors filled the air as they approached the landing zone. Sarah could see her teammates waving frantically, urging them to move faster. The elderly woman she was helping stumbled, and Sarah caught her just before she fell. Looking into the woman's eyes, Sarah saw fear but also gratitude. In that moment, Sarah knew that every risk she had taken was worth it to save these innocent lives. The extraction was successful, but Sarah's day was far from over. Back at the base medical facility, she worked tirelessly to provide follow-up care for all the civilians they had rescued. The elderly man with internal bleeding required immediate surgery, which Sarah assisted with for over 4 hours. Her uniform was stained with blood and dirt, but her focus never wavered as she helped save his life. Word of Sarah's heroic actions in the village spread quickly throughout the base. The other Marines talked about how she had risked her own life to stay behind and save civilians who couldn't protect themselves. Captain Rodriguez submitted a detailed report of her actions, recommending her for a commendation that would recognize her extraordinary courage under fire. However, the stress of the mission and the long hours Sarah had been working were beginning to take their toll. She had been pushing herself beyond her limits for months, often skipping meals and sleeping only a few hours each night. Her fellow medics noticed that she seemed more tired than usual, but Sarah insisted she was fine. She had never been one to complain or ask for help when she was struggling. 3 days after the village rescue mission, Sarah was called to respond to another emergency. A training exercise had gone wrong, and several Marines had been injured when a piece of equipment malfunctioned. Sarah grabbed her medical kit and ran toward the training area, ready to help her fellow soldiers once again. She had no way of knowing that this routine call would change her life forever. When Sarah arrived at the scene, she found 2 Marines with serious injuries. One had a deep cut on his leg that was bleeding heavily, while the other appeared to have a concussion from being struck by falling debris. Sarah immediately went to work, applying pressure to stop the bleeding while simultaneously assessing the second Marine's head injury. Her training had taught her to handle multiple casualties, but the exhaustion she had been hiding was starting to affect her concentration. As Sarah worked to stabilize the first Marine's leg injury, she suddenly felt dizzy. The world around her seemed to blur for a moment, but she shook her head and continued working. She couldn't let her own problems interfere with saving lives. The Marine with the head injury was becoming increasingly confused, which indicated a serious brain injury that required immediate attention. Sarah knelt beside the second Marine and began examining his pupils with a small flashlight. As she leaned forward to get a better look, another wave of dizziness hit her, this one stronger than the first. She gripped the Marine's shoulder to steady herself, hoping that no one would notice her moment of weakness. The other Marines at the scene were focused on securing the area and calling for additional medical support. Despite feeling increasingly unwell, Sarah continued to work on both injured Marines. She had successfully stopped the bleeding in the first Marine's leg and was now focused on keeping the second Marine conscious and alert. She talked to him constantly, asking him questions about his name, the date, and where he was. His responses were becoming slower and more confused, which worried her greatly. As the evacuation helicopter approached the landing zone, Sarah stood up to signal the pilot. The moment she got to her feet, the world began spinning around her. She felt a strange tingling sensation in her arms and legs, and her vision started to tunnel. Sarah realized something was seriously wrong with her own body, but she couldn't stop now. The injured Marines needed her help getting to the helicopter. Sarah took a step toward the landing zone and stumbled. Corporal Johnson, who had arrived with the helicopter crew, immediately noticed that something was wrong with his friend. He called out to her, but Sarah seemed not to hear him. She was focused entirely on making sure the injured Marines received the care they needed, even as her own body was beginning to fail her. The helicopter crew rushed forward with stretchers for the wounded Marines. Sarah tried to give them a medical report on each patient's condition, but her words came out slurred and confused. She knew the information was critically important, but she couldn't seem to form the words properly. The concerned looks on her colleagues' faces told her that they could see something was very wrong. As the last injured Marine was loaded onto the helicopter, Sarah finally allowed herself to acknowledge that she was in serious trouble. She looked at Corporal Johnson and tried to tell him that she needed help, but before she could speak, everything went black. Sarah collapsed to the ground unconscious, just as the helicopter began to lift off with the Marines she had worked so hard to save. Corporal Johnson dropped to his knees beside Sarah's motionless body, his training as a medic immediately taking over despite his personal fear for his friend. He checked her pulse and breathing while calling frantically for medical assistance over his radio. Sarah's pulse was weak and irregular, and her skin had taken on a pale grayish color that indicated serious medical distress. Within minutes, the base's emergency medical team arrived at the scene. Dr. Williams, the chief medical officer, took one look at Sarah and immediately ordered her transport to the base hospital. As they loaded her onto a stretcher, her fellow Marines gathered around, their faces filled with worry and disbelief. Sarah had always been the one taking care of everyone else. Seeing her so helpless and vulnerable was shocking to everyone who knew her. At the hospital, Dr. Williams worked quickly to determine what had caused Sarah's collapse. Blood tests revealed that she was severely dehydrated and suffering from extreme exhaustion. Her body had been running on empty for weeks, and the stress of the recent missions had finally pushed her beyond her physical limits. More concerning was the discovery that her blood pressure had dropped to dangerously low levels, which explained her loss of consciousness. Captain Rodriguez paced the hospital corridor, waiting for updates on Sarah's condition. He blamed himself for not recognizing the signs of her exhaustion sooner. Sarah had been working longer hours than anyone else on the base, often volunteering for the most dangerous missions without being asked. Her dedication to saving lives had made her invaluable, but it had also put her own health at serious risk. As word of Sarah's collapse spread throughout the base, Marines from every unit began gathering outside the hospital. Sergeant Martinez from the engineering unit had been treated by Sarah when he suffered a severe burn injury. Private Thompson From communications remembered how Sarah had stayed up all night monitoring his condition after he was wounded in a mortar attack. Each Marine had a story about how Sarah had touched their lives. Dr. Williams emerged from Sarah's room after several hours of treatment. He explained to Captain Rodriguez that Sarah's condition was stable, but she would need extensive rest and recovery time. The combination of dehydration, exhaustion, and stress had put enormous strain on her cardiovascular system. She would need to be medically evacuated to a hospital in Germany for more comprehensive care and monitoring. The news that Sarah would be leaving the base hit the Marine community hard. She had become more than just a medic to them. She was their guardian angel, the person they knew would always be there when they needed help. The thought of continuing their deployment without her seemed almost impossible to many of the younger Marines who had come to depend on her guidance and support. Captain Rodriguez visited Sarah as she was being prepared for evacuation. She was conscious but weak, her usually bright eyes now dulled by exhaustion and medication. When she saw her commanding officer, she tried to sit up and apologize for collapsing during a mission. Rodriguez gently pushed her back down and told her that she had nothing to apologize for. She had given everything she had to serve her fellow Marines. Sarah's evacuation flight was scheduled for the following morning. As the medical transport team prepared her for the journey, Marines continued to gather outside the hospital. What started as a few concerned friends had grown into a crowd of over 200 soldiers who wanted to show their support for the medic, who had risked everything to take care of them. Corporal Johnson sat beside Sarah's bed during her last night at the base. They talked quietly about their homes, their families, and their hopes for the future. Sarah worried about the Marines she was leaving behind, wondering who would take care of them in her absence. Johnson assured her that she had trained the other medics well, and that her legacy of courage and compassion would continue even after she was gone. As dawn broke over the base, the medical transport helicopter arrived to take Sarah to the airfield. The pilots were surprised to see hundreds of Marines lining the path from the hospital to the landing zone. Word had spread through unofficial channels that their beloved medic was being evacuated, and every Marine who could get permission to leave their duties had come to say goodbye. Sarah was moved from her hospital bed to a transport stretcher for the journey to the helicopter. As the medical team wheeled her outside, she was overwhelmed by the sight of so many fellow Marines standing at attention along her route. These were the people she had served, the lives she had saved, and the brothers and sisters who had become her family during the most challenging time of her life. The crowd of Marines was silent as Sarah passed by, but their presence spoke volumes about the impact she had made on their lives. Some had tears in their eyes, while others saluted as she went by. Sarah tried to wave to as many as she could, her heart breaking at the thought of leaving them behind when they still needed her care and protection. As Sarah's stretcher reached the helicopter landing zone, something extraordinary began to happen. Captain Rodriguez, who had been walking alongside her stretcher, suddenly stopped and came to attention. Without any command being given, he raised his hand in a crisp military salute directed toward Sarah. Within seconds, Corporal Johnson joined him, then Dr. Williams, and then every Marine within sight. The spontaneous salute spread like wildfire through the crowd of Marines. What had started with a few officers became a sea of raised hands as over 500 Marines simultaneously honored their fallen hero. Sarah had never received such a tribute during her military career, and the sight of so many fellow soldiers showing their respect moved her to tears despite her weakened condition. The helicopter crew, who had transported many wounded soldiers during their careers, had never witnessed anything like this scene. The pilot, a seasoned veteran with over 20 years of service, later said it was the most moving display of military respect and brotherhood he had ever seen. The co-pilot took photographs that would later become legendary within the Marine Corps community. Sarah tried to lift her hand to return the salute, but she was too weak to maintain the gesture for more than a few seconds. The Marines holding the salute didn't waver, maintaining their tribute until Sarah was safely loaded into the helicopter. Many of the younger Marines were crying openly, not caring who saw their tears as they said goodbye to the woman who had saved so many of their lives. As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah looked down through the window at the hundreds of Marines still maintaining their salute on the ground below. The base grew smaller as they gained altitude, but she could still see the formation of soldiers standing in perfect tribute to her service. It was a moment that would stay with her for the rest of her life, a reminder of the bonds she had formed and the lives she had touched during her deployment. The flight to Germany took several hours, during which Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness. The medical crew monitoring her condition was pleased to see that her vital signs were stabilizing, but they knew she still had a long road to recovery ahead of her. The stress and exhaustion had taken a serious toll on her body, and it would take weeks or possibly months before she would be fit to return to active duty. At the military hospital in Germany, Sarah received comprehensive medical care from a team of specialists. They confirmed Dr. Williams's initial diagnosis and began a treatment plan that included rest, nutrition therapy, and psychological counseling to help her deal with the trauma and stress she had experienced. The hospital staff was amazed by the number of letters and cards that began arriving from Marines at her former base. Captain Rodriguez had organized a letter-writing campaign to keep Sarah's spirits up during her recovery. Every Marine who had been treated by Sarah was encouraged to write and tell her how her care had impacted their lives. The letters poured in by the hundreds, each one sharing a personal story of how Sarah had made a difference during their darkest moments in the war zone. Private Martinez wrote about how Sarah had held his hand during a painful medical procedure, talking to him about his family back home to distract him from the pain. Sergeant Williams described how Sarah had saved his leg after he stepped on an improvised explosive device, working for hours to repair the damage and ensure he would walk again. Each letter painted a picture of a medic who went far beyond the call of duty to care for her fellow Marines. The hospital staff was so impressed by the volume of correspondence that they created a special display board in Sarah's room where they posted some of the most moving letters. Sarah spent hours reading and rereading these messages, drawing strength from the knowledge that her service had made a real difference in so many lives. The letters became an important part of her healing process. As weeks passed, Sarah's physical condition steadily improved. Her strength returned gradually, and the color came back to her cheeks as her body recovered from the extreme exhaustion that had nearly killed her. The psychological counseling helped her process the intense experiences she had lived through and gave her tools to manage the stress that came with her chosen profession. During her recovery, Sarah learned that she had been awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal for her heroic actions during the village rescue mission. The citation specifically mentioned her decision to stay behind and risk her own life to save wounded civilians, calling her actions in keeping with the highest traditions of the Marine Corps and the United States Naval Service. More importantly to Sarah than any medal was the news she received about the Marines she had treated. The 2 Marines injured in the training accident had made full recoveries thanks to her immediate care before she collapsed. The civilians from the village rescue were all alive and healing well. Every life she had risked everything to save had survived, making her sacrifice worthwhile. After 2 months of recovery in Germany, Sarah was declared fit to return to limited duty. However, her experience had changed her perspective on military service and her own limitations. She had learned the hard way that taking care of others meant she also had to take care of herself. The military doctors recommended that she transition to a training role where she could share her extensive field experience with new medics without the physical demands of combat deployment. Sarah's return to the United States was marked by another surprise ceremony. The Marine Corps had decided to use her story as an example of courage and dedication for new recruits. She was assigned to the medical training facility at Camp Pendleton, where she would teach combat medicine to the next generation of Marine medics. It was a role that would allow her to continue serving while maintaining her health and well-being. The video of her salute ceremony had been shared throughout the Marine Corps, and Sarah had become something of a legend among military medical personnel. Young medics would seek her out for advice and guidance, inspired by her story of sacrifice and dedication. Sarah took this responsibility seriously, always emphasizing to her students that their own health and safety were just as important as the lives they were trying to save. In her new role as an instructor, Sarah developed new training protocols that better prepared medics for the psychological and physical demands of combat medicine. She incorporated lessons about recognizing signs of exhaustion and stress, both in patients and in themselves. Her curriculum became a model that was adopted by military medical training programs across all branches of the armed forces. Captain Rodriguez, who had been promoted to major, visited Sarah at Camp Pendleton 6 months after her evacuation. He brought with him a photo album filled with pictures from the base, including the famous image of 500 Marines saluting her as she was evacuated. He also delivered personal messages from many of the Marines she had served with, updating her on their lives and continued service. The reunion was emotional for both Sarah and Major Rodriguez. They talked about the lessons they had learned from her experience and how it had changed the way the military approached the care of its medical personnel. New policies had been implemented to ensure that medics received adequate rest and support, preventing others from reaching the point of exhaustion that had nearly cost Sarah her life. Sarah's grandfather, now in his 80s, visited her at Camp Pendleton to see her in her new role as an instructor. He sat in on one of her classes, watching with pride as she taught young Marines the skills they would need to save lives in combat. After the class, he told Sarah that he had never been more proud of anyone in his entire life, and that she had exceeded even his highest expectations for military service. The story of Sarah's courage and the salute she received from 500 Marines became part of Marine Corps folklore. New recruits learned about her during their training, understanding that true heroism sometimes meant knowing when to ask for help and take care of oneself. Her legacy influenced military culture, promoting a healthier approach to service that valued both mission accomplishment and personal well-being. 5 years after her collapse, Sarah was promoted to gunnery sergeant and given command of the entire combat medicine training program. She had revolutionized how the Marine Corps prepared its medical personnel for the rigors of combat service. Under her leadership, the rate of stress-related medical evacuations among combat medics dropped significantly, while the quality of medical care in the field continued to improve. Sarah never forgot the moment when 500 Marines saluted her courage, but she also never forgot the lesson that had nearly cost her life. She continued to serve with the same dedication and compassion that had made her a legend, but now she did so with wisdom and balance. Her story became a testament to the fact that true courage sometimes means admitting vulnerability and accepting help from others. Today, Sarah continues to train new generations of Marine medics, passing on not just technical skills but also the values of service, sacrifice, and self-care that define the best of military medicine. The salute she received that day remains one of the most powerful displays of military respect in Marine Corps history. But for Sarah, the real victory was learning that she could continue to serve effectively while also taking care of herself. Her legacy lives on in every medic she trains and every life they go on to save.